Welcome to the Australian Property Podcast, helping you achieve success in property. Featuring your host, Jonathan Preston.
Hi guys, thanks very much for tuning back into the show. So in today's episode, I want to talk about the Sydney median now being double that of Brisbane. If you'd like to get in touch, send me an email at jp@australianpropertypodcast.com.au. Alright, let's get started. Alright, so you may have noticed in terms of the numbers recently that where Sydney is moving at the moment, median now has reached about 1.1 million, and that's compared to around 550 for Brisbane. So we've got pretty much a perfect double in terms of the median price for a property in Sydney compared to that of Brisbane. Now, when you sort of take this figure into account, you need to also look at what the average annual wage is for each area, and that's because basically it's kind of a multiple of the income as a way of measuring, I guess, affordability. Obviously, a lot of the top end industries are based in Sydney, so there are people that are obviously making way more than the average, but this is like an average figure, not a median in terms of the earnings. The median figure, the house price figure is a median, which is like a most common, but the earnings figure that I've got is actually an average. To give you a comparison there, so New South Wales average annual wage that I've got for the second quarter 16, I've got here is 80,132. By comparison, if we look at Queensland, it's 75,936. So there's actually a very, very minimal difference in terms of what the average, earnings are. It's less than a 10% difference, but when you look at the house price difference, we're looking at 100% difference in terms of it literally is double the price. So when you look at things from that perspective, you can sort of get a better idea that the multiple against income is wildly different, and it's obviously a lot more affordable to purchase in Queensland. Now, there is talk that a lot of the inquiries for properties in Queensland right now are coming from the eastern states, primarily Sydney and Melbourne, and that's because people are looking at properties there and seeing how much cheaper it is. There's obviously the talk about interstate migration being strong as well, with people, particularly again from the eastern states, migrating to Brisbane, and that's because Brisbane and the Gold Coast, I guess, and it's like you can sell your house in Sydney and buy the equivalent in Brisbane for half the price, and then be left with 500 grand in the bank, which you can literally invest and basically pretty close to live on the interest. And depending on your age, you may not even need much of a drawdown. If you combine that with your super or any other assets you may have, literally you may be able to retire as long as you're not super young and you don't have a huge mortgage. So that, I guess, offers an attractive proposition for many eastern state residents. You've obviously got a nice climate up in Brisbane as well. Not a half bad place to live in terms of beaches and everything like that too. So you've got quite a lot of attractive features in Queensland that are attracting the eastern states, people from the eastern states. When we look at the investment side of things, obviously Brisbane's been a hot spot for some time, particularly for Sydney-siders and people in Melbourne. Obviously, a lot of these people have been sold to as opposed to buying. Being sold to, I would define as where you get someone who is in particular selling generally off the plan properties, and someone who puts a hard sell on you to actually buy, as opposed to you actively going out into the market and searching for a property. that's where a potential buyer's agent who would be looking at established properties would come in. Or if you've done your own research and you're doing your own hunt and then you're buying, then that's obviously where you're a buyer as opposed to being sold to. But a lot of the off-the-plan properties in particular have been sold by people in various different professions with large kickbacks, and those people I would define as being having been sold to as opposed to being buyers. Now, I'm not in love with those off-the-plan properties, and I think that there is a bit of an oversupply concern. Regardless, it's pretty much inevitable that over the long term, those properties will probably do fine based on the price that people are largely paying compared to what the income is up there. A lot of these properties are going for only a couple $100,000, and people, if you're on 75 grand a year, it's not hideously unaffordable. Obviously, you don't have the overall overseas migration and the super strong economy that we've got in, say, New South Wales, and the continual migration and good economy that we've got in Melbourne as well. But at the same time, you do have very attractive prices against the median. It's not like the income is really, really low in Queensland either. And I've talked for a long time about the people, from, I would say, parts of Asia and other parts of the world. I think as we see more and more sort of pollution and industry takeover and everything, I believe that Queensland will, eventually show up as one of the more attractive places in the world to actually migrate to. We see that with the eastern states, people, moving there once they have enough wealth and I guess to enjoy the twilight years. But I think that that's going to become increasingly popular with overseas, people who are looking to move here, who have already made their wealth, based on the extreme value that you get when you're looking at buying properties there. For the cost of an apartment in many parts of Asia, you can buy a whole house in Brisbane. You've got a really, clean and green kind of place that you can live. It's not full of pollution. You've got beaches, you've got decent earning potential for your kids, you've got good opportunity for education as well. So I think that we're going to see over a 20-year time frame a bit of a transition in terms of the dynamics of Brisbane and the Gold Coast. Obviously, the economy there is a little bit more fickle than what you'd find in Sydney, and there does tend to be a bit more of a boom-bust mentality when it comes to property prices. I would say partly that would be due to partly the mining exposure and partly due to the interstate investing. If any of the eastern states suffer, then obviously one of the first things that happens is that people pull their money or they stop pouring money into Queensland particularly. So there is more volatility in that regard versus where people are buying owner-occupied properties. They tend to be more committed, and when it is a place that you actually reside in, there's more emotional connection to it. As a result, you might suffer before giving the property up, but if it's just an investment property, people tend to be more happy to sell out or walk away because the ramifications to their day-to-day life are less, and it's not quite such a significant hit to them. So these are just some of the things that I think are going to be, things for us to watch over the coming years. I do think it's interesting that the variance between prices is so significant when the average earnings difference is so modest. I think that over time we are going to see this gap close up a little bit. In previous years we did see that, particularly if you go just prior to the GFC. Brisbane had a very strong run, I guess Queensland in general, and Sydney had kind of lagged a little bit. So I think that in the next sort of decade, we're going to see a little bit of catch up from Brisbane. I do expect Sydney to go higher, but I expect Brisbane to close the gap a little bit. Main, factor there is how this ongoing supply is going to be taken up, by investors from both overseas and interstate. Also how mining plays out does, affect Queensland as well. Luckily, we have seen a bit of an upturn in mining in recent times. But basically, I think that the Brisbane market, if you can buy well and you've got a long-term horizon, it still presents a number of opportunities. I think if you were migrating to Australia, it'd be hard to choose Sydney with the house prices where they are if you're able to get comparable work in Melbourne or Brisbane, just because the lifestyle differential is significant, and we are seeing a lot of Kiwis moving to Brisbane or Gold Coast, and that's because house prices are very modest compared to many parts of Australia, many parts of New Zealand, and you can still earn good money. So we are seeing that a lot, and obviously I guess there is some attractiveness around the the heat and the basically the lifestyle, I guess, that is perceived that you receive in Queensland as opposed to New Zealand, where it tends to be a bit cooler and rains a bit more. And I say this as a Kiwi myself. So anyway, it's going to be interesting to see how the future plays out, but I am bullish over the long term, and definitely interesting to see where the current figures are sitting. I really appreciate you tuning in today. Thank you. Thanks for listening to today's episode. Please subscribe to the podcast, and if you've enjoyed the show, I'd really appreciate it if you could leave a review on iTunes and recommend the show to any friends that you think might benefit. Thanks again for listening, and we hope to see you back soon.